Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Accelerating Digital Transformation with API Lifecycle and Test Automation. First, at the bottom of your audience console, you'll find a number of widgets for questions, slides, and additional resources. When you have questions for the presenter during the webinar, click on the Q&A widget and submit your question. We will answer as many questions as possible at the end of the webinar, and if we run out of time, we'll get back to you via email. Second, a copy of today's slide deck will be available in the resources folder at the bottom of your screen. Third and finally, if you need any tech support during the webinar, please use the help option. With that, I'll introduce our presenters for today's webinar. Eran Kinsbrunner, Chief Evangelist and Author, Zvika Shaha, VP of Product Management, and Mukesh Thakur, Senior Solutions Consultant here at Perforce. Eran, Zvika, Mukesh, thanks for joining us on today's webinar.
Thank you for inviting us, and truly excited to join forces with Akana and drive this webinar on the API Lifecycle Management and Test Automation. Hi, Zvika, and hi, Mukesh.
Hi, Eran. Thanks for having us with you today.
Hello and welcome. My name is Mukesh Thakur. I'm from Perforce Akana. We provide strategic guidance and technical expertise and services to our customers in the API space. We partner with our customers on their API journeys and make them successful in their digital transformation initiatives. I'm glad to be here to talk about the API technology and solutions offerings. To set the stage, let's hear from Eran, our Chief Evangelist from Perfecto, about APIs and test automation. Take it away, Eran.
Thank you, Mukesh. Just before I start, Zvika, just a word about yourself.
Sure. Thanks again. So my name is Zvika. I'm the VP of Product at Perfecto, working with global digital leaders these days to make sure that their continuous testing journey helps them to mature their overall DevOps and ensure world-class quality of their application, extend the coverage, and by that, achieve better user and customer fidelity for all digital services. We'll talk here today more about, the natural connection between the functional UI side of the house and the API, and the combined power of the tools together to really ensure that level of quality. Thanks again for having us today.
Thank you. So today we are going to talk a bit about digital transformation, especially these days where kind of the market is reshaping and changes. We're going to give a brief introduction to what are API and some kind of a recipe for API testing and API test automation, the importance of API quality as a fundamental building block to the entire application quality. Then we're going to move more to the API lifecycle management, where Mukesh is going to walk us through the different stages, the different flows, and actually a best practice of end-to-end creation and management of an API. At the end, we're going to run through a nice demo where Zvika is going to run us through a Perfecto and Akana end-to-end creation, execution, and analysis of an API through promotion of this API, from a development lifecycle perspective. So starting with today's reality, digital engagement is becoming more relevant than ever. Okay, we are now in the era of this COVID-19. It's a fact. And if up until recent, I would say, few months, digital transformation was obviously a reality and a very important thing to many businesses, today it's a necessity. Engagement from the end users across multiple geographies can only be done through digital, which means you need to have all your web applications, mobile application, everything working, functioning in a high performance and security manner. Otherwise, your business is simply suffering from business losses. That's the easy translation to the reality of today. So in order to ensure good digital engagement with your brands, with your end users, you need to have a very optimized delivery pipeline. And what I mean by that, you want to have as high innovation throughput and quality through the delivery pipeline as much as possible. But to do so, you need to have a robust test automation and high quality of deliverables throughout the different stages of, the famous test pyramid, the unit one, the integration, the API, the UI, and everything else, including the non-functional layers. Unfortunately, the reality today does not always enable full automation throughout the life cycle, and it often results in either escape defects to production or lack of automation coverage, as Zvika mentioned earlier, which results in sometimes high costs, again, defects that are escaping to production, and lack of innovation. So again, you want, especially these days when you want to enhance your digital engagement, you want to have as high and mature test automation throughout the pipeline from all different testing types, starting obviously with the unit and API, moving up to the UI. With that, let me just briefly state what is an API for those of you who are not familiar. So obviously, API is an application performance interface, programming interface, enabling developers, but also at the end of the road, end users to engage with your application, whether it's a web application or a mobile application. And this is kind of a bridge between many services, applications, products to ease a lot of the things that are, without these APIs, quite complex and maybe expensive to develop in-house. So APIs serve a lot of purposes throughout the entire development lifecycle. When we talk about APIs today, a lot of the APIs that we are familiar with are RESTful APIs. I will later on show you an API example from the Perfecto library. But when you think about REST APIs, you need to be quite familiar with the common methods that are enabled by these REST APIs, such as GET, POST, and PUT. There are others like update and delete. But basically, these APIs are the tools that can be used to get information from one service to the other, update services, or sometimes delete and stuff like that. If you want to make it even more simple than that, this is kind of an API analogy that looks at a restaurant as kind of an API back and forth, where a client will order some kind of a meal. The API in that case will be the waiter, where he's getting the request from the client, sending it back to the kitchen, which will be in our case the server, returning back the result or the response back to the client. So this is, in a very high and naive way, a way to look at an API. With regards to test automation, again, I will later on move to the to the test pyramid. But API and functional or UI testing, and actually non-functional testing as well, are serving two sides of the same coin. At the end of the day, if something doesn't work on your application, whether it's a web application or a mobile application, honestly, the end user really do not care if the root cause is in an API or in a UI layer. Sometimes can be a glitch in the UI. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, you want to have a complete end user experience, and it can only be achieved through covering all different types of testing: functional, non-functional, UI, and APIs. Before I move to an API example from Perfecto, Zvika, do you have any comment to add on this slide? I know that this is a slide that is close to your heart.
Yeah, so, in fact, if you think about any button, any function, any operation that exists on any kind of application that all of us know from, our day-to-day, behind each one of them, there is a set of APIs that operates that in the background. The ability to make sure that on the one hand, the functional aspect of the app, is aligned with the expected behavior. works well, the performance, as you just mentioned, Eran, and many other non-functional aspects. But on the other hand, each and every API that is associated with any object or button that we have in the screen is kind of a complementary aspect of that. And we see today among the Perfecto customers that, each and every testing team is conducting both of these hand in hand to make sure that, everything is aligned with the expectation and the KPIs that are set for the app.
Excellent. Thanks, Vika. So with that, if you want to think about kind of an API example taken from the Perfecto library, and Perfecto has a large list of RESTful APIs that you can use to send requests, get back responses from the Perfecto environment. This is just a link in the slide that you can go through just to understand what are the different options or capabilities. But basically, so the slide just jumped. But if you look at the API example, you can see that in this example, the request is to execute a simple test suite, simple test XML file. That's the suite or representation of a suite that resides in a private media repository. We are sending in the request, obviously, the security token of the user, and this is an example of how a response would look like from the Perfecto in the Perfecto cloud. So this is just one example from a real-life implementation, actually, of the Perfecto cloud, just to bring everything a bit more close to the reality. With that, let's just talk a bit about, okay, how are you testing, or are you bundling API testing in the entire test automation strategy? As we mentioned, API quality is very, very important. It lies behind every button or service that we have behind our customer-facing and internal applications. But you need to have a good balance between all of these types of testing activities, starting from the unit where your developers would typically write their feature-specific unit testing in different languages, typically from their IDEs. Then you have the upper layer, which is the API, where I'm going to double click in just a second. What does it mean? And upper than the API, you have the more functional, non-functional UI, exploratory testing that obviously are quite important for a great user experience. When you combine all of these testing activities and you can automate them as much as possible, shift them left early in the cycle, this is, the common best practice to achieve high-quality applications throughout the board. The only thing to mention here is that achieving test automation across these different layers is important, but you want to have this done continuously. This is where Perfecto, as a continuous testing provider, kind of comes into play, enabling you to do both API testing, performance, and other non-functional testing, but also functional testing on both web applications and mobile applications in a cloud-based environment, enabling you to actually get a full coverage of end-to-end testing types in a kind of governed and cloud-secured environment. So what kind of defects API testing can identify? And when you look at this slide, you see, okay, I see functional bugs, I see reliability issues, I see security and performance. Some would say, okay, I get these kind of defects also when I'm running functional and non-functional testing. But that's exactly the point. This is where you want to be smart about your strategy and balance the UI and non-functional testing with API testing. There are a lot of things, values that API testing can bring to the table, kind of even overcoming limitations that UI testing cannot do for you. For example, with API testing, you can kind of overcome the login screen and do some more inputs or injections, for example, through the login process of a lot of illegal stuff and maybe insecure things that the UI layer is not exposing. So API testing can definitely complement a lot of the functional and non-functional activities in your cycle and identify defects that are ranging from, again, functional to non-functional. Obviously, security is a very great and important aspect of API testing, and also performance testing. How can an API and the application work when the service is undergoing extreme load conditions, especially these days, when you look at a lot of websites today, and the websites and the mobile applications are the main channels in today's reality. Think about, go to boots.uk, the Boots pharmacy in the UK website. Today cannot really cope with all the requests that are coming to order medications and many things like that. This is also something that could have been and should have been validated through both functional, non-functional, but also API testing to understand how the system actually works under load. Security, again, is another topic that is important to mention around API testing. So to summarize this specific slide, there is a lot of things that are in common between functional UI, non-functional testing, security, and more testing types, and API testing. One comes hand in hand, as mentioned in the previous slide. They are serving two sides of the same coin towards a very high and robust mobile or web application. In a very high level manner, this is kind of a diagram that testingexpert.com are providing, suggesting. I wouldn't argue with that. I think a lot of these things make total sense here, combining both, as you see here, GUI testing or UI testing with API testing on the business logic area or tier, and how to set your environment for API testing, how to promote an API between the different stages or life cycle of the application toward a very good API functionality. I wouldn't spend too much time on this slide because, again, we're going to see a nice end-to-end demo later on by Zvika. Before I move over this slide over to Mukesh, I wanted to just summarize a very important thing here, especially today when we are talking about digital-only engagement. I think that the cloud is becoming an essential component or enabler for digital quality, regardless if it's web or mobile or both. Perfecto, when we are defining the benefits of a cloud solution, we are focusing on these top 8 benefits. Okay, I mentioned earlier in this presentation the key benefits of high quality pipeline, test automation throughout the entire pipeline. To be able to get an optimized delivery pipeline, you need to have a robust infrastructure that enables you to do so. And a cloud exactly serves this purpose. I'm just to mention a few of these benefits in a high level. You want to keep up with all the web and mobile operating systems that are being released. Just this week, a new iPhone got released, a new Edge browser, Edge 83 was released. Keeping up with all these platforms, so you are testing your APIs and other functional and non-functional testing against the latest and greatest platforms that your end users are using is very, very critical. Having an environment that is always available, reliable, and up to date is another critical thing, especially these days when teams are working remotely. Both developers and testers are not sitting these days in the same room. They want to have a joint resource that they can work and test against, and the cloud facilitates just that. Having enterprise-grade secure environment is another key benefit of testing in the cloud. Unlimited test automation scalability. I just mentioned the different testing pyramid, and Zvika is going to mention it later on. So it's not just about the API, it's API and performance and functionality and exploratory and manual testing. It's all about having the maximum test automation coverage for your digital quality. And there are other not less important benefits such as productivity anywhere, cross-team collaboration, disaster recovery and being ready for audits, cost-effective. You do not need to maintain, especially today you cannot even maintain your lab because you're not working from the office. So you have a cloud that is easily maintainable for you and up to date. It's a huge productivity boost to your entire team. So with that, I think I provided a nice high-level overview of, again, what is an API, how to approach API testing and how it fits in the overall test pyramid, and then how you can take everything together in an optimized delivery pipeline and conduct it in a cloud secured environment. With that, I would like to hand it over to Mukesh so we can talk a bit more about the API end-to-end lifecycle management. So I'm handing it over to you, Mukesh.
Thank you, Iran. Couldn't emphasize more on the much-needed testing for APIs when the scope and the portfolio for API is ever-growing. APIs are in existence for decades. We know them as adapters, connectors, drivers for machines or printers, let's say, or web services, which are designed typically to integrate enterprise systems and partners. We know them as EAI or B2B. With the evolution of mobile technology, industries have shifted the focus towards API to become business ready with partners and customers. We check whether do banking transactions or make purchases on our phone. All the apps we interact are actually calling the APIs. You know, the APIs are working in the back end to bring the results for us. So also in today's time, APIs are helping small businesses and, let's say, restaurants to quickly open their businesses directly to the consumers and integrate with the partners, as in delivery partners. All right. With that, let's talk about the Akana API management platform, which consists of products and components together provide complete visibility and control over API landscape. It helps organizations define and implement API strategy aligned with the business objectives and goals. In other words, we have the finest ingredients and we can tailor recipes to your taste. I'm going to briefly talk about the highlighted capabilities of the Akana platform, vertical order, and I'll start with the API design here. The platform provides API designer for API developers to write or specify their API definition. They can define the resources, mention about the input and output formats about the API using the embedded OS3 editor. If that's not the preferred way, we have a form wizard for API developers to pick method, a verb, a path, model, and design schemas, tag the operations together so it is nicely presented in a grouped fashion, right? So if we have an API which have resources like catalog, so all the catalog operations are shown together on the API document page. And likewise, we can have a items group to interact or to update or delete or change or add items. We can show all the item operations together. API security is, Iran emphasized a little bit on the security side. So we have integrated security component. We have out-of-the-box policies, which can provide industry standard security for the APIs. On top of that, if there is a special use case which does not meet the out-of-the-box policies, we allow users to create new policies or configure them to meet the security needs. On the mediation side, we can expose a SOAP backend as a RESTful API. We can also do protocol mediation by deploying them on the Akana host. The Akana platform integrates with the multiple sources in the backend, allows seamless traffic between the Akana and the backend systems. We can control the consumption of APIs by defining the SLA rules. We can define a rule for a throughput or to limit bandwidth or request message size. So API traffic management is another powerful mechanism available out of the box where we can visualize the consumption of the API in real time. We can measure the API round trip time. How much time did it take for us to process the request and return the response? How much time was taken by the backend system in the whole round trip? So we can pinpoint which system is taking more time, and we can improve the performance for APIs likewise. API Portal is a UI designed for developer engagement. It brings the two developer communities, the API developers and the app developers, together on a single UI, so that we can have a good collaboration between the two teams for successful digital transformation. API analytics provide business metrics for the business community to derive value from the traffic processed on the Akana platform. So there's a slide I'll talk a little more on how we can achieve that business value. Lifecycle management can be achieved by a product which is a design time product, and it integrates with the DevOps tools to provide the automation and controls for API provisioning or promotions. The platform can be deployed on-premise, or it can be deployed in the cloud. We support the known cloud environments, or it can be a combination of both. Right? Moving on to the next slide. So this slide is themed as automated provisioning, testing and promotion of APIs or deployment of APIs all the way from your first environment, which is development, all the way to the production. For this example, I'm showing 3 environments. It could be different number, 2 or 4, based on customer needs. So typically, Jenkins workflow starts and it pulls the artifact from a repository. It adds or publishes that API artifact into the development environment, which kicks off a notification to the respective API developers or owners community, which can come in, inspect the API, make sure the needed documentation is in place, and then if they are satisfied with the unit testing, they can initiate the promotion of the API to the next environment. So the component which is shown in the middle of the diagram manages the lifecycle of the API. It's actually the lifecycle coordinator. It works on a hub-spoke model. That means it interacts with each of the platform environments to allow for import and export of the APIs and propagate into the next environment. So once the API is successfully added or propagated into the pre-prod environment, we can trigger a notification or a workflow to the API testing system. In this case, it's going to be Perfecto. So once the notification or the workflow is triggered by the lifecycle coordinator, the Perfecto system can perform all the desired testing, be it load testing or stress testing, performance testing, security testing, and functional testing. When the testing is completed, the Perfecto system can deposit back the test results into the Akana pre-prod environment. Once again, we can initiate notification to the stakeholders for the APIs to inspect the test results, verify all the test results are passed and meets the security guidelines and performance guidelines or the rules set up as a strategy. And then we can initiate the promotion of that API from pre-prod to the production environment. Once again, the component in the middle pulls that artifact and then propagates into the production environment. During this promotion cycle, we can apply some rules to achieve automation in dynamically applying security policies, setting the privacy attribute for the API. Is this API a private API to be consumed or visible only to the internal or enterprise audience, or is it a public API so that it is visible to the world in a public space? We can choose the deployment zone. Where do we want to deploy this API when we promote it from, let's say, pre-prod to prod, right? The data centers could be geographically dispersed. There could be a data center in North America. The other data center could be in Europe or Asia. So based on the audience or the consumer base of the API, we can deploy the API in all deployment zones or specific deployment zone as part of the promotion automation. We can also change the backend URL for the API. As Akana is a proxy for the API, it simply receives the request and sends it back to the hosting system, the backend system. That backend system is different in each environment. The development Akana platform is pointing to the development backend. So is the pre-prod and prod. They have the respective backend systems to point the APIs to. So on the fly, when we promote the APIs, we can make change to that backend URL so that there is less human intervention and then reduced chances of errors. We can also change the access control for an API. So when we start the API with the development environment, we are not really testing for security. We allow anonymous access to the API so that the owner or the developer can do a functional testing or simple unit testing for the API. But once we promote that into pre-prod or prod, we want to control it. We want to restrict the access only to the authorized apps. So that switch can be changed during the promotion of the API. On top of the promotion rules, we can introduce promotion approvals by designated user or roles. We may not introduce the approval process when we promote it from development to pre-prod, but we really want the teams to get involved, get notified, and give their consent and approval that yes, we are ready to onboard this new API. We know it will be easily accommodated with the load we are going to introduce. So we can introduce some approvals so the parties can review the readiness of the API and approve it for the promotion into the next environment. Moving on to the next slide. The Lifecycle Manager is a design time application. It integrates with the Akana runtime components and DevOps tools and provide much needed automation to provision and promote the APIs. It is a governed asset repository. That means the asset we create in the repository are validated. They follow the rules and strategic guidelines of data collection. As we collect the metadata about the APIs, we can define workflows and SDLC processes to meet the waterfall or agile type of project management. The extended metadata allows us to define those dynamic rules for the APIs or apps or the users. The application is a role-based access supported. That means we can define the roles and assign the users to perform certain or specific functions in the tool. As we saw in the previous slide, it integrates with the DevOps to allow interaction with the other systems. And once we have the asset or a repository of assets in place, we can look at the impact analysis. For example, there are customers have implemented this tool to manage their infrastructure, IT infrastructure. So they have created assets as in networks, subnets, servers, applications, and consumers. So by creating a relationship between those assets, they can visualize the impact. What if a subnet is taken off or for maintenance or it goes down? Who are the impacted parties for it? So at least when we are doing some maintenance in our environment, we can give a heads up or at least give a communication that this is the maintenance window and your application or servers are part of this job and may be impacted during this time. Other customers have implemented this tool for clinical trials. There's a healthcare company which uses it for the clinical trials. There's a finance company which uses it for business events. So it's a very flexible and powerful tool to allow for automation in development and by using the workflows. Next slide. This is just an example of how we collect metadata during API creation. So on the slide, we are asking the API creator or the developer in this case to provide the type of data API is going to transact, whether it will be PCI type of data or PII type of data, so that we can involve the security team to give their consent and review the security aspect of the API. This is a customizable form. That means we can define this form and list the fields or information we want to collect during the API creation, which can help us group the APIs, or generate a report showing all the APIs which transact PCI type of data, so we can get a nice report out of the system for it. The API portal is a developer engagement portal. That means we bring the two developer communities, the API developers and the app developers together to collaborate during the API creation, testing, consumption. The app developers can look at the APIs shown in the catalog. They can test their apps against that API, and if they like the API, they can request access for the live endpoint for it. The issues with the consumption of APIs can also be reported by the app developers directly to the API owner. So it triggers a notification for the API owners to know this API needs some attention by one of the consumers, and they can take the corrective actions. The portal is basically a marketing tool for the APIs. So organizations can customize the look and feel to meet their marketing strategies. So, the color schemes or the logos and the documentation or description of the usage of API can be tailored to the needs of organization. This portal is also used by the administrator to define the domains to integrate with, for example, OAuth providers, OpenID Connect, to allow signing to the portal. We have out-of-the-box OpenID Connect systems like Google or Facebook connectors so that users can use the single sign-on mechanism to sign up on the portal. The consumer community, again, can make use of the integrated forum to interact with the owners of the API. We have a documentation section where the API owner can upload HTML, PDF, or text type of documents to describe the API, its functionality, how it serves the purposes of an application being consumer of the API, what's the sample request, what's the sample response, what's the load, what's the expected performance, or the time it takes to bring back the results. All that API description and help documents can be uploaded along with the ticket modules, which is again described earlier. It also provides the consumption metrics, as in the operational metrics for the API. There are little graphs at the bottom showing the API consumption in real time, or API consumption by app or the consumer, or which operation is highly consumed over other operations. So all that metric is available out of the box. Moving on to the next slide. The API gateway is the most critical component, I would say, out of the platform, because this is the interface, or this is the layer which sits in between the consumer and the provider of the API. Well, the first thing it provides is security by obscurity. That means the consumers of the API have no visibility beyond the gateway. So they don't know where that API, the actual API, the backend API resides. It could be in the enterprise network, or it could be in the cloud, and there's no way to learn which part of the world that backend system is established. So that's a nice way to protect your backend systems from, the hackers or people who don't like to follow straight route. The architecture for this API gateway is highly scalable and very performant, so we can scale it based on the needs or load we are going to run on this platform. It ensures for data privacy. That means we can enable TLS protocol all the way from the client to the backend to secure the transaction. We can do mediation, as in the message mediation. We can translate or transform messages from JSON to XML or vice versa using XSL transformation. And there's another tool embedded in the product called FreeMarker, which can be used for mapping or generating custom transformation for the messages. For the API security, we have out-of-the-box security policies available. There's a bunch of security policies actually shipped with the product, which can be utilized to secure the APIs quickly. And again, if you're not happy, or you need some special or custom rule, security rule, you can create your own policy. Authentication, authorization, auditing is a standard security provided as part of the product. We can enforce SLAs. We talked about it. And the platform also integrates with the antivirus systems through the ICAP protocol, so that the request message, with the attachment coming in, can be scanned by the antivirus system, and then, based on the results, we can do a go or no go for the API request. We can reject or forward that request to the backend system. Last slide on the deck is about the business analytics, which complements the platform by creating some value for the business community of an organization. So based on what we transact on the API, the request message body or response message body, we can derive these business metrics, right? If we follow Iran's favorite dessert, donuts, if the APIs are used to sell donuts for the users or apps, we can see which item is selling more, what time of the day it is sold more, what is the demographics of the consumers, right? If all that information is available, we can create near real-time graphs or charts for the business community to take decision on how do we improve our business. The visualizations are all configuration driven. That means we don't need any coding to arrive to these fancy charts or diagrams. With that, I come to the end of my slide presentation. We now invite Srika to show us the applications in action. That means a demo of API provisioning and testing using Perfecto. Over to you, Srika.
Thank you very much, Mukesh. Hope that you can see my screen now. So I would start by saying, as you guys mentioned, it's all about, a process. It's all about the lifecycle management and the ability to start your journey by defining a specific API, a specific operation, mature that enough in order to push that forward. As then you can see here in an example from, the Akana lifecycle management, I'm looking at a specific API. This API goes to some kind of a pet store website. In this case, the format is a Swagger format, but again, any textual format is a non-issue in that sense. You can see the different operations that I have for my site, for my different pages. If I'll expand one of them, as an example, you can see the body of any request. You can see also the expected responses that I want to see here. And I can also manually kind of run my unit test here, invoke the API and get the different responses, see, in a different format way, the response that I'm getting here. The question is what am I doing with it, when I have a rich set of, APIs that as a creator, I want to push them forward and I want to take them to the next step. I have different types of operations, as you can see, from the post to the get, different activities that I want to promote as part of my life cycle. And in this case, this is where, the power of the joint portfolio here and the ability to run an example of stress test, to be able to upload any of these APIs to the Perfecto environment, again, from the Akana to the Perfecto environment, and to be able to trigger execution at scale, because that's what Perfecto is all about. It's all about, continuous testing, the ability to test, different aspects of your application, of your digital service at scale, while extending the coverage as much as possible. So talking about the same API, let's say, set of tests or a job that can be triggered or run from Perfecto. This job includes, in my example here, 3 different tests that I've been uploading to Perfecto. In the example, you can see here the graphical kind of editor that we have, including the ability to run the authentication flow that is associated with some APIs, all the way to be able to validate the operation status and make sure that, the HTTP or HTTPS response is set as expected. The beauty here is that I don't have to go and click one by one. I'm setting for myself different type of jobs that I can execute in different ways or formats from Perfecto. So I will trigger it manually, from here. I will run this example on a browser just to show, in the UI, the response validation. But of course, majority of any API test would run headless. So this is just for the sake of the example. But again, at scale, we're not expecting any type of testing of the API itself. If I'm looking at, some of the results that I can actually get here, the interesting part is that if I look at this job, I can actually schedule the stress test that I'm looking for. In my case, I'm executing this test every hour. I can change it and run it even every 15 minutes or 30 minutes. And I run it every day. That gives me a better kind of notion about the stability, the maturity of any API, and my ability to promote it as part of the life cycle. Again, this is an internal scheduler that the tool has, but the same would go for my ability also to integrate that with CI. So I can run it from Jenkins, from TeamCity. I can just take the command line and embed it in any kind of shell command and run it even from my console. The interesting part on the other side, and Mukesh talked a lot about the analytics, is the ability really to consume the result and understand what can I actually do from here. Now in this, view, you can see that I'm running in my environment tens of thousands of test cases from different angles of the product. As Eran mentioned earlier, the API test is one layer among multiple layers that I have in my testing: functional, non-functional, performance, monitoring, and of course the API. So I have examples of activities or tests that I'm conducting, and based on the test, status that I'm getting, I can also, decide whether I need to conduct some actions on specific APIs that are broken, or alternatively promote them to the next layer. So we can see here in the CI job dashboard that we have a job that is being executed as I triggered it. We can easily, double click on some of the tests, either from here or from the heat map. For example, in this case, for the pet store test, I can see that I have APIs that are stable, while I have others that are not really stable. If we look at this example, and we're taking screenshots just to validate, some aspects, you can see that this response is getting, 200, and accordingly give us green light to promote these tests to the next level as part of our life cycle. The ability to slice and dice the data on different views, just like this one. The ability, of course, from here to get different views or screenshots or other logs that are required to complement that in case that we're running in the front end with the browser. But again, majority of the work will be conducted headless. Still, we have the ability to retrieve different logs, network files, and others. And the network file actually is a good example for things that we're looking at. The example for that would be the ability to feedback, the Akana system with some HAR files. The ability to track on the network level different activities that are happening, different calls, and by that, use it as kind of a new discovery model that will keep feeding, from Perfecto to Akana and back, and make sure that we're closing the loop in a continuous mode, as Eran mentioned, and by that I'll hand it over back to you, Eran. It's all about the continuity and the ability to measure that over time and be able to track, adjust, promote, or disqualify specific APIs and activities based on the status that we're getting. That's the secret behind continuous testing and what we're doing together with our customers to make sure that we mature their DevOps activity that includes those different layers that we've covered here today. Back to you, Eran.
Thank you, Zvika. I think that this demo kind of gives a nice summary of not just both of the solutions, but actually the best practice of how you want to basically look at continuous testing, continuous quality of your digital apps, starting from the lower levels and the APIs up until the upper levels. With that, prior to going to the Q&A, Mukesh, do you want to just give a final connection between these two solutions, and with that we will wrap up the content?
Definitely, Iran. Thanks, Vika, for the excellent demo. Well, that actually concludes our presentation and demo. We hope that the perfect combination of Akana and Perfecto technologies can help organizations accelerate their digital transformation initiatives. We like to invite you to our web pages, akana.com and perfecto.io, so that you can learn more about our products and services, or you may want to sign up for a free trial. The information is already available in the resources folder. With that, I'll hand it over back to Megan and see if there are any questions for us.
Thank you very much, all. We do have a few minutes left for questions. Our first question from the audience asks, what is the right balance between API testing and other testing types?
So I can take this one, and I think basically if you look at the test pyramid, it will give you the total components, the balance between these components from API, unit, integration, functional, and non-functional should depend on multiple considerations, starting from the application complexity, the skill set that you have in the organization, and the ability to obviously automate as much as possible through these different layers. The recommended practice is to obviously automate as much as possible on the unit and the API layer, and only leave, the extreme UI testing, functional testing and non-functional testing to the automation layer in the upper one, specifically because of more stability that you can gain from API and unit testing. However, in the digital landscape that we live in, where you have so many permutations of mobile and web, not doing functional testing on the UI layer simply is a huge risk. So again, you want to do the right balance, but you want to also match this balance within the organization, again, based on the type of the application, the complexity, the skill set and technologies that you have within the team, and obviously the process as well, whether you are doing Agile, BDD, TDD, or other methodologies that you are following.
Thank you, Iran. Our next question is, what is the performance impact of applying multiple security policies to an API?
Wow, that's a great question. Yes, as the platform allows us to protect APIs by applying multiple securities or policies, the good news is we cache those algorithms or policy rules on the gateway itself. So maybe the first call takes a little longer in order to create that cache, but thereafter the performance is seamless. You'll not see any impact on the API performance by applying multiple security policies. In fact, even if you try to create a comprehensive or a complex process by stripping some of the headers or injecting headers on the fly, these all rules are cached on the API gateway. Further, we provide caching policy to overcome the performance challenge. The caching policies can be implemented or applied to some of the API resources. For example, if an API is returning a list of branches which do not change frequently, right? A list of locations for a bank or any restaurant. So those things do not change. Caching can help us achieve the performance, and that will then reduce the traffic between the Akana and the backend.
Thank you, Mukesh. We have time for one more question. is there a recommended strategy to cover both API and other testing within a given regression cycle?
Zvika, you want to take this one and I can complement that?
Sure, I'd love to. So again, as mentioned earlier, these are, the two sides of the same coin. When we build an API, we want to validate that that API is complementing properly also a UI or a functional element of our application. So the best practice is to actually, build like in a TDD approach, build the two tests, on the same time, make sure that we can test any new API that we've created. And by that, be able to promote that API forward. And on the other hand, we want to make sure that any UI object or functional element of the app that calls that API is set properly and tested as part of the functional suite. The combo of the two, marching forward, in our point of view, is the optimal coverage and the ability to make sure that on both ends we are, we've completed the testing properly, the validation, and the ability to promote the app to the next phase.
I think this is perfect. Just, of course, the keyword here on top of everything that Zvika mentioned is to have this automated, shifted left, obviously, in the cycle. So you have both the UI functions being automated and obviously the APIs. So you get fast feedback within the build cycle upon each and every change done either to the API or to the other layers. With that, I think you have a good strategy.
Great. Thanks so much, guys. That's all we have time for today. If we didn't get to your question, we'll reach out to you via email. Thank you to our audience for your attendance and for your participation today, Eran, Zvika, and Mukesh.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.